Go for it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you. And I am pleased to rise and add my voice to what is an incredibly important discussion. There is, of course, a host of issues that this place is seized with on a regular basis, but for those who might be watching, the idea of privilege, and privilege is a word that has quite a few definitions, I think especially in the world in which we live, but it speaks to something that is very specific when it comes to the parliamentary context, and that is the ability for a member of parliament to do their job well. And Mr. Speaker, in your ruling earlier today, you outlined how the actions of a foreign state actor impeded the ability for 18 parliamentarians to be able to do the job that they were elected, or in the case that if that included or more senators, to do the job that they are sent to these houses to do. And I think that it is key to outline that, because it's not simply a matter that can be taken lightly. It is something that needs to be treated with the utmost seriousness. And I will, in the time that I have before proceedings adjourn for this evening, try to outline a few reasons as to why that is such an important aspect to the debate that we're having on the ruling that you made earlier this evening. As parliamentarians, there is a host of things that happen beyond simply the debates in this place. And in your ruling, you noted how that the actions of the cyber attack it was directly related to, although did not necessarily have the direct implications to debate, but was about the larger duties that members of parliament have. And I think that for many, this is what people see on television. It's the clips in this place. It's the press conference outside the doors not far from us. But it speaks to the bigger issue about what our democratic infrastructure is. And I think that's absolutely key. So to use myself as an example, and I know many others in this place, in our support for our ally Ukraine, many of us were found, were sanctioned by the Putin regime in Russia. And it was for our strong stance in support of our democratic ally, and that is a consequence of the actions that we undertake in this place. For myself as well, although not a universally held opinion, proud to be a strong supporter of the state of Israel and its right to exist. And I know, especially since the happenings of October 7th, there's been a host of developments around that. I'm not just talking about the conflict itself, but when it comes to the international conversations and some of the geopolitical dynamics associated with that. We see, of course, the issue that we are speaking about today when it comes specifically how the organization known as APT-31, affiliated with the communist dictatorship in Beijing, targeted certain members of parliament, but it's part of the larger conversation around the geopolitical influence of the communist dictatorship in Beijing, and specifically for many of us in this place have made strong statements. And I know my colleague that just finished speaking has brought a number of bills forward throughout his career in Parliament about support for Taiwan and how Taiwan can be treated on the international stage. And it's important context, again, because this is some of the work that we do as parliamentarians, and we have to be free to be able to do that work well. And we've seen over the last number of years how there have been significant attempts by hostile foreign regimes not to simply engage in the political discourse, not to even when it comes to Russia sanctioning myself and many other of the colleagues in this place, it's gone beyond that to try to use fear and intimidation tactics, or some of those tactics that would be more familiar in spy movies. things like espionage, things like spyware on computers. As a member of the Ethics Committee, and I know, Mr. Speaker, you spent a long time on that committee, there was a host of conversations that were had around whether it's on-device surveillance tools, whether it be during the pandemic, the use of tracking information from cell phones. There's a host of information that is available, certainly in the digital age, and not to get into a conversation around AI and some of those developments that I think are essential parts of what need to be the conversation with us. But when you have a hostile foreign regime that has a very, very specific political agenda attempting to use tools nefariously to possibly influence, try to manipulate what Canadian parliamentarians are doing within the scope of their duties in this place. So I appreciate the finding of this breach of privilege, this prima facie breach of privilege, and I'm hopeful, and from what I've heard throughout the debate tonight, I am optimistic that when this important debate comes to a vote, that we will be able to send this to PROC, where they will be able to propose solutions, some of which will complement, I would suggest. And you noted in your ruling how this is different than one of the previous instances where the member from Wellington Halton Hills had brought forward a question of privilege, and there was another member, the now former member from Durham, Aaron O'Toole, who was leader of the Conservative Party in the 2021 election, had brought forward a similar motion, but because of in part the timing and some of the developments that at that point his case was not found to be, but I believe the Speaker had encouraged the PROC that at that point in time was seized with that issue to include that in its study. And certainly there's been a host of developments that have taken place since that point in time, revealing truly the extent to which specifically Beijing, but other foreign state actors have attempted to and seen the ability for them to be able to influence what we do here in this place. Now, specifically with Madam Justice Hogue's report, we see how there was the potentiality of impact in the last election. And I think that that's one of the things where we have to be seized. And what's interesting, and I was quite frustrated with how the government responded initially to some of the accusations around foreign influence in the elections. And part of my frustration was around the fact that it was they simply declared that it wasn't an issue and therefore it wouldn't have changed the result of that election. And there was certainly much debate in the media and amongst parliamentarians, even in this place, as to what that exactly meant. But Justice Hogue made a very, very what I think is important contribution to highlight how Canadian elections are not simply one election. It's not like a U.S. presidential election, but rather it is, in the case of the current Parliament, 338 individual elections, and there is evidence that suggests that there could have been substantial impact. And I know the former member from, I believe it's Steveston, Richmond, sorry? Richmond, Stevenson East. It's late, Mr. Speaker, so you'll forgive me on that. Thank you to my colleague. But we see how it had a significant impact. And hearing some of, again, before the Ethics Committee, some of the ways to which his integrity was impugned, how even though he is a Canadian of Chinese descent, was impugned by and absolutely horrific things said about his personal character, about his Chinese background, and how that was spread often in a language that is not one of Canada's official languages, that led to having a significant impact, and how specifically the candidate who ran for the Liberal Party and ultimately defeated Kenny Chiu in the 2021 election certainly didn't separate himself or fight back against what was clearly disinformation, a clear attempt to take what Mr. Chu had brought forward, specifically when it comes to a foreign agent registry in the form of a private member's bill, to bring that forward, and what would have really taken this whole conversation a whole giant leap forward. There was a clear effort to see that stalled, stopped, and the impact was what very well could have been the change of an election result. And that has had the impact of causing Canadians ultimately to see an erosion of trust in their institutions. Now, when we see some of the host of issues surrounding that, that's one example that has brought a whole host of opportunities for us to debate within this place, and of course different committees are doing good work on that. And I know PROC also has had a chance. But I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that there's an important dynamic here that can't be lost in the midst of it. And it is that while there is the impact that it has upon the privileges that we have in this place, and you highlighted that within your ruling, but beyond that, it has a specific and very significant impact on diasporic communities that might be impacted. So take the three examples that I listed earlier when it comes to my personal connection, whether that's supporting Ukraine, being a supporter of the State of Israel, or whether that be taking a strong stance in support of Taiwan. That is something that as a parliamentarian I can do, and I willingly take those positions and present that to the Canadian people. And certainly it's justified to make sure that I can do that freely and fairly within this place. But, Mr. Speaker, I would encourage you and all those participating in this debate to consider the impact that that has on regular Canadians, those that are not protected by the same rights and privileges that we have in this place, those of Chinese origin, those of Ukrainian origin, those that are connected with Israel and might be Jewish. Mr. Speaker, we are seeing how and I would suggest part of the reason why we need to take this so seriously is to make sure that all Canadians, regardless of whether of which I am proud to be one, take our seats in this place, or whether that be a new Canadian that deserves to be protected and to have their government take seriously the potentiality and a real significant a threat that they would try to be influenced, manipulated, coerced by a hostile foreign state actor. Now, my colleague that spoke earlier, and we've heard it a number of times this evening, how there has been a host of examples of that, whether that be these police stations, some of which may still be operating. But to think, and at first, Mr. Speaker, when I started receiving correspondence based on some initial media reports, I had the thought that this can't be real. This can't be happening in our country. Yet we've learned that not only is it happening, but there was an unserious response to that. When it comes to some of the foreign election interference, again, you think, well, we guard our democracies. That's key to who we are as Canadians. We're proud of that democratic legacy that dates back, and I talk often about this, that dates back to the foundation of the Westminster system. And yet we see that over the last two elections, there was a concerted effort by hostile foreign states to impact the results of the election. And again, we see a government that did not take that seriously. And then we see, Mr. Speaker, how there is that potentiality of Canadians' personal information, and how that impacts every segment of our society, our economy, and the ability for Canadians to go about their daily lives. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I would like to and would encourage members in this place to consider some very developing news. And that's Premier Eby out of British Columbia making an announcement only earlier this evening that there was a sophisticated cyber attack that was leveled against the BC government. Now, while there are not extensive details yet, I'm sure we will learn those in the coming days, the fact that we have one of 10 Canadian provinces facing a cyber attack like that, called Sophisticated by the Premier of British Columbia, that it sounds like, and I hope certainly that British Columbians' data was protected. We see that these are very real and present threats to how Canadians live their daily lives. So in light of the privilege debate, and that's very, very important because that's key to our ability to operate as a democracy, but I would encourage us to take take seriously how this impacts regular Canadians who are not given the same rights and protections that we are as MPs, that don't have the infrastructure or the ability to appeal to a speaker, to say, to see the issue studied and a report brought back, because it is a regular Canadian that may be now questioning whether or not the email they sent criticizing the regime of a family that includes a family member that may still live there, what that impact might have on them, whether or not that somebody could be listening. There are so many unanswered questions. And what I have been frustrated with since being elected to Parliament is how the current government does not seem to take that seriously. So in the few minutes that I have remaining, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the trend of the government only responding to serious issues when pushed to the point where it's become public is simply not good enough. We see this time and time again. Thank you. We see this time and time again. We see this with the example of my former Conservative colleague, Kenny Chiu. He brought forward a private member's bill on a foreign agent registry. And it was criticized significantly by other parties, said it was unnecessary, was a significant and maybe the contributing factor to his electoral defeat. Yet now we have a bill brought forward by the government after there has been so much scrutiny that would do functionally very similar to what Mr. Chiu had proposed more than 2 years ago. And I think that is a clear example of how not treating seriously the demands of government is leading Canadians to not only lose trust in their institutions, but to lose trust in the government's ability to keep them safe. And as was highlighted in some of the conversations surrounding this, the fact that we learned about this, and look, there's no question that the American intelligence infrastructure is probably the most sophisticated and well-funded in the history of the planet. But that doesn't excuse the necessity for how our institutions here, whether that's as a Five Eyes partner, whether that's as a member of NATO, whether that's as a G7 country, it doesn't excuse our need to be at the front of ensuring that not only are we protecting Canadians, but that we also have and are doing everything we can with the tools available to us to make sure that MPs, senators, in the case of the prima facie breach of privilege, but further, Mr. Speaker, that all Canadians can trust that they will be protected by their government. And so what I would suggest is that we need a very serious response to this. And what Conservatives have advocated for all along, and this goes back long before I was elected, is to make sure that we take these threats and concerns very, very seriously, to treat them with the gravity to which they deserve, so that not only parliamentarians are free and able to do their work, and I know I heard from my colleague from Calgary-Mindapore talking about questions that she was asking as soon as she learned about when this attack might have taken place. There was a host of questions. Well, what was she talking about back in January of 2021 and all of these things, and to have almost 2 years later find out about these things. Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that it speaks to a trend that is very, very concerning, and one that is showing a certainly lack of trust in the ability for the current government and the Prime Minister in the security process. It was highlighted earlier about how there's conflicting testimony from the Prime Minister himself, that he doesn't read reports and just gets high-level briefings to his Chief of Staff that says that he reads everything everything. These are the sorts of things that Canadians, they may not be seized with them on a daily basis, but Mr. Speaker, it speaks to a trend of how concerning the lack of response is. So as I close my speech, Mr. Speaker, I would simply say this. I would encourage all members of this place to vote in favour to ensure that this goes to Proc and gets the attention that it deserves. Not simply for MPs and senators, parliamentarians, but, Mr. Speaker, to show all Canadians that the pinnacle of Canada's democratic institutions takes our security and their security seriously, because we haven't seen that thus far under this Liberal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.